land that both Krissy and I and a few of you who might be joining us as well are from. So the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I acknowledge this is a place also from your elders and your the owners of the traditional lands of which you're Zooming from. And this is always, has been and always will be a place of creativity, community and storytelling. So before we introduce our special author today, I will be introducing Krissy. So for those who don't know, avid readers, incredible events coordinator, is also an award-winning author. So Krissy Kneen is the author of 7 works of fiction, non-fiction and poetry. Her latest novel is Wintering. She has written and directed documentaries for SBS and ABC and is currently developing 2 TV series with Strane. She was recently awarded the Copyright Agency 2020 Fellowship for Nonfiction. So that is quite recent news. So we're very celebrating with Krissy for that. So Krissy, over to you, and really excited to be here for this event today.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I'm excited to be here for this event today because this is a novel that I absolutely inhaled. So if you haven't read this yet, oh my goodness, you are in for a wild ride that is going to continue to excite you as you read. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Kate Elizabeth Russell, who's originally from Eastern Maine. She holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of Kansas and an MFA from Indiana University. Her work has appeared in Hayden's Ferry Review, Mid-America Review and Quarterly West, among other journals, and has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She currently lives in Madison, Wisconsin. And so welcome, Kate. Welcome to Avid Reader.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. My Dark Vanessa, this book here, is a story of Vanessa Wye, who had a sexual relationship with her much older teacher when she was 15. When she is 32, at the height of the Metoo movement, another former student is accusing the teacher, Jacob Strane, of statutory rape. Other women come out against Strane and Vanessa is under pressure to add her voice to theirs. The only problem is that Vanessa has immortalized this relationship as her great love story, and to redefine it as rape would be to remove the foundations that she has built over a whole life. It is a complex, interesting, fascinating story, and what Kate does is give us the complexities, and she doesn't make it easy for us, which I think is one of the reasons why I love this book so much, because you read a lot about this kind of thing, but often you know your position you're supposed to take, and it feels like you're being kind of spoon-fed a position that you already have, whereas this book challenges you and makes you think for yourself, which is wonderful. So congratulations on the book, Kate.
Thank you.
I thought that we might start off by getting a little bit of a taste for the book. So if I could get you to just do a little bit of a reading up front, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. So I'm going to read about 1.5 pages from really the opening of the novel. It starts on page 5. And this passage, I think, gives a good impression of where Vanessa is at 32 at the opening of the book. When Strane and I met, I was 15 and he was 42, a near perfect 30 years between us. That's how I described the difference back then, perfect. I loved the math of it, 3 times my age. How easy it was to imagine 3 of me fitting inside him. 1 of me curled around his brain, another around his heart, the third turned to liquid and sliding through his veins. At Browick, he said teacher-student romances were known to happen from time to time, but he'd never had one because before me, he'd never had the desire. I was the first student who put the thought in his head. There was something about me that made it worth the risk. I had an allure that drew him in. It wasn't about how young I was, not for him. Above everything else, he loved my mind. He said I had genius level emotional intelligence and that I wrote like a prodigy, that he could talk to me, confide in me. Lurking deep within me, he said, was a dark romanticism, the same kind he saw within himself. No one had ever understood that dark part of him until I came along. It's just my luck, he said, that when I finally find my soulmate, she's 15 years old. If you want to talk about luck, I countered, try being 15 and having your soulmate be some old guy. He checked my face after I said this to make sure I was joking. Of course I was. I wanted nothing to do with boys my own age, their dandruff and acne, how cruel they could be, cutting girls up into features, rating our body parts on a scale of 1 to 10. I wasn't made for them. I loved Strane's middle-aged caution, his slow courtship. He compared my hair to the color of maple leaves, slipped poetry into my hands, Emily, Edna, Sylvia. He made me see myself as he did, a girl with the power to rise with red hair and eat him like air. He loved me so much that sometimes after I left his classroom, he lowered himself into my chair and rested his head against the seminar table, trying to breathe in what was left of me. All of that happened before we even kissed. He was careful with me. He tried so hard to be good. It's easy to pinpoint when it all started, that moment of walking into a sun-soaked classroom and feeling his eyes drink me in for the first time, but it's harder to know when it ended, if it really ended at all. I think it stopped when I was 22, when he said he needed to get himself together and couldn't live a decent life while I was within reach. But for the past decade, there have been late night calls, him and me reliving the past, worrying the wound we both refused to let heal. I assume I'll be the one he turns to in 10 or 15 years, whenever his body begins to break down. That seems the likely ending to this love story. Me dropping everything and doing anything, devoted as a dog, as he takes and takes and takes.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Look, this is such a complex book and there is so much to unpack in it. But the thing that was center stage for me really was the question of young women and sexual agency, and the idea that, you know, we understand that no means no, but is there ever a point where yes can mean yes if you are under a certain age? Was that something that that was at the heart of your, well, it took a long time to write this book. So was that something that you were struggling with for all those years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when I was younger if I would have said I was struggling with it. I was more approaching that question because I started working on this book when I was a teenager myself. And so when I was working on this at 16, 17, even like 18, 19, I was approaching that question with this idea of like, well, of course, I myself have agency. Girls my age have agency, and the idea that we don't have the ability to know what we want, that seemed ridiculous. And so that evolved, of course, as I got older and continued to work on this book, but also just grew up myself. But what I tried to do was retain that in Vanessa's character, and really take her seriously, not try to undercut her or undermine her in the narrative by having my sort of like 30-something-year-old, very more knowledgeable voice to sort of insert myself, but letting her speak for herself and assert her own agency. And I think that is where a lot of the tension comes from in the narrative, because I wrote this assuming that the reader would feel a certain way about the situation that was at odds with how Vanessa feels.
I mean, that's really interesting that you started writing this when you were a teenager, because, you know, you're what, 34-ish now? Something?
36.
36.
Just turned 36.
Okay, happy birthday. And I just wanted to look at the kind of, because that's a really long period of time. And I know in my life, my thoughts on everything change, you know, year to year, let alone over a period of 18 years that you took to create this book. So can you take us through that kind of the book? Did you think that you were going to write it as a teenager and publish it as a teenager, and then did it just kind of tick forward over the years? How did this manuscript arise?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever thought when I was younger, like, oh, I'm going to finish this and publish it, because the thought of publishing a book when I was young, when I was really young, just seemed completely out of reach. It wasn't until I was older and started studying creative writing, like in graduate school, that the sort of logistics of publishing became clear to me. But when I was young, I was just so driven. I had so much creative energy, and I just wrote all the time. Like it's the only thing I really wanted to do. I neglected schoolwork. I didn't really have much of a social life. Like, I would go home and I would write all night, basically every day after school. And the thing that was sort of driving that was just the pure joy of it. And it's funny, I just sort of took that for granted. I thought that just made me like a weirdo when I was young. But looking back, I'm like, oh no, that was something really special. And even like the people around me didn't really point it out as something like special and unique. And so I don't know, it's a weird thing looking back and being sort of awed by my creative drive. But that was the thing that was really pushing the writing and making me want to do this, was just the joy of it. And then when I went to college, and deciding what I wanted to study, it was like, I can study writing. Well, of course I'm going to do that. And then I went from my undergraduate creative writing program into a master's. And that's when I started to really think of this as a novel, because when I was young, I would write sort of disjointed scenes, and I didn't really worry about how they'd all come together. But yeah, as a master's student, started thinking about it as a novel, and then eventually got a PhD in creative writing. And that's when I really buckled down and decided I'm going to get this written once and for all.
Well, it plays out on two timelines. It plays out on the timeline when Vanessa is 15, and then when Vanessa is 32. And I found that really interesting for a couple of reasons. One of them is that those two voices are really distinct between the young Vanessa's voice and the older Vanessa's voice, and also that it gives the narrative a kind of a drive, because you want to find out what happened to Vanessa and how she's become this 32-year-old. And I gather you didn't write those 32-year-old scenes when you were 15.
No, I didn't. Yeah, the split narrative, I feel like I started really thinking about that, about writing the book that way when I was probably in my late 20s. And that came after I started reading a lot about trauma. And I read, when I discovered critical trauma theory, which is sort of unpacking the way that trauma manipulates the brain, how it can be rendered on the page in literature. Like, how do you write a flashback? How do you write an unreliable narrator whose mind is sort of suffering from PTSD? Like, once I sort of discovered that kind of academic work, it really changed the way that I was thinking about this story. Because when I was young, sort of like Vanessa, I saw this as a dark, complicated love story. And I was really, it wouldn't have made sense to me to think about this as a story of trauma, because consent is given on her part, right? And she's a willing participant in her mind. But then once I started learning about trauma, it changed the way I saw this. And that's when I started thinking about the best way to show a traumatized character, and it felt incomplete to write this in a purely like linear chronological way, because I didn't want the reader to get too comfortable, I guess, with the idea of just teenage Vanessa or just 32-year-old Vanessa. I wanted the reader to have a well-rounded impression of her at all times, as much as they could. And that's sort of what that split timeline gives, I think, is so you don't just see her as this sort of exalted teenager who feels like she's having an affair and this really thrilling thing, and you don't just see her as 32-year-old broken woman. You see both of them almost simultaneously.
It works. It really kind of gives the narrative a kind of a drive to move forward into the future, which is fantastic. There's actually a quote from the book from Vanessa. Even if I sometimes use the word abuse to describe certain things that were done to me, in someone else's mouth, the word turns ugly and absolute. It swallows up everything that happened. It swallows me and all the times I wanted it, begged for it. I thought that was a really interesting kind of look at the idea that that you give your character agency to be able to kind of say, no, this was not necessarily, I don't want you to call, I can call it abuse, but I don't want you to see me as a victim. And I wondered how you kind of, do you see Vanessa as a victim when you were writing it, or did you see her in this more complicated way?
Yeah, I never thought of her as a victim when I was working on it, because I was, even if I know sort of intellectually that she is in this way of like objectively looking at her and her experiences, like, yes, of course she's a victim. But when I was writing her, I was so deep in her perspective that I couldn't to think of her as a victim would be to think that I know this story better than she does. And it sounds sort of like new agey or like woo woo just when I start talking about the way that I tried to inhabit her psychology, but I had to like surrender myself to her, because she's a character who I've been working with for so long, for so many years. Like, I felt like I knew her through and through. And even when I was a teenager, when I first started working with her as a character, I felt like she came to me fully formed almost, which is this thing you can't really explain. But so just sort of letting myself go and embodying her was essential to writing this. And so I couldn't think of her as a victim. I had to think of her as someone who was rejecting the idea of victimhood for legitimate reasons. And she sees it as to accept that she was a victim would be to really give up on the most significant, important, formative relationship of her life, and then what would be left? And to her there's no satisfying answer to that question, because she's, at 32 she's so isolated after all these years of sort of dealing with this secretive relationship and defending it and sort of telling herself these stories to make it more palatable. She's just too isolated to give up on it.
Yeah, well, I think that isolation that she ends up in is really interesting, because in a way it kind of speaks to the culpability of those around her, the adults around her, and it's not just a story of her and the relationship to Strane. It's the story of her relationship to a community that didn't side with her and didn't support her, and that continues not to side with her. So I wonder whether you opened it out. I mean, it obviously started really well within that character, but did you then open out your research to look at the community's culpability for young women's trauma?
Yeah. And it's funny, over the years, the school, like the actual high school where it takes place, for a long time there wasn't anything really remarkable about that school. But once I started paying closer attention to these stories that started coming out over the past 10 years or so of sexual abuse happening at private schools, and the way that sexual abuse was often covered up or sort of excused away, I saw a real connection there, between those stories and the novel that I was working on. And also thinking of like a boarding school in particular, and how that, sort of aids in the isolation that Vanessa is experiencing because she's away from her parents, away from her family. That was really on my mind. But it's a difficult thing, because she is, throughout the course of the novel, the school behaves in a certain way that they're sort of protecting their own interests instead of looking out for this vulnerable student. But then you have other characters, adults and sometimes peers of Vanessa, who try to help her, but their attempts to help her are sort of fall apart because they approach her in a way where they're like, you don't know what's best for you. You might think that this is your experience, but it's not. You're wrong. And that just makes her dig her heels in more and makes her cling to Strane even more. And so, yeah, even those attempts to help, those good intentions just end up making the situation worse.
Yeah, and class plays in to that as well a lot too, because her first school is, you know, is it Browick? Is the school? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that is much more you know, it's a much more posh school than the one that she ends up afterwards. And of course, she is a scholarship student, so she's one who doesn't, you know, have the financial backing that some of those other girls do.
Yeah, I wanted that to be part of Vanessa's character, part of why she, you know, doesn't really have a lot of friends at this school, but also having that be potentially something that Strane sees as something that he could take advantage of. But also Strane comes from a lower class background as well, so there's also, I think, the potential to read that as a genuine, you know, point of connection between the two of them, if you're willing to think that those genuine connections do happen between these two characters. So yeah, just wanting it always to be complicated, you know, every sort of detail to be able to be looked at a few different ways.
Well, let's look at Strane. I mean, Strane himself, if looking at him from the outside, it's easy to see him as someone really distasteful. There's lots of descriptions of him which are not flattering, and there's lots of ways that you as an adult reading the book can see him manipulating a child by his actions and by his words. And I wonder whether he metamorphosed over the years that you were writing the book, because I am pretty sure that 15-year-old you would not have seen all those nuances in a character like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing because when I look back to the earliest stages of working on his character, I think he was, I wrote him as this conflicted man who was not necessarily trying to do the right thing, but who had to be convinced by Vanessa a lot more than the Strane that ended up in the final novel. So he was, I think the way that I wrote it as a teenager, I was influenced by the Lolita trope, I guess, in a way that was uncritical on my part. And so Vanessa was more of, you know, she wasn't like a teenage temptress necessarily, but that was informing the way that their relationship dynamics played out on the page. Like she was trying to like egg him on, I guess, and she was the instigator. But then once I started learning, focusing more on trauma and really centering the story unapologetically on her, Strane's character morphed into much more of a villain, one-dimensionally. So he felt almost monstrous and like kind of scary, and I didn't, you know, I was okay with that because I didn't feel much interest in him as a character, I guess, at that phase of the writing process. I think because I was so excited to, you know, unpack these ideas of sexual abuse and how it affects a person. And so I was so obsessed with Vanessa at that point. But then I realized that by flattening him, I was really selling Vanessa short because so much of her complexity hinges on him being a multi-dimensional character with depth. And it's funny, novel writing, it really does come down to that. You can't put too much onto one character or any one element of it. You have to spread it around. And so yeah, I tried to make Strane, I tried to write him in a way where the reader sees why he's so compelling to Vanessa while also seeing his behavior for what it is in terms of being manipulative or coercive or what have you.
Yeah, it is really interesting that you've got that there has to be a balance between all of those characters in the book, because it's that fine balance that actually makes the book work, because otherwise, you know, it could turn into something that was just too romantic to be believable, or something that is, you know, too cliched, I suppose,
Yeah.
to be believable as well. But it just plays that fine line. And the other really interesting thing that you look at is the idea of the sisterhood, I suppose, with the background of the Me Too movement, and the idea that that women are being called for to add their voices to this call-out culture. And I wonder, you know, how you dealt with that, because Me Too was something that would have come in as you were finishing this book, I suppose, and that idea that that women have to speak out, and yet and Vanessa kind of refuses, flatly refuses to be a part of that. Can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah. The Me Too movement really started in the US, at least, and I think it's spread pretty quickly in October 2017. And that's when I was in the home stretch of writing the novel, because I had to submit it as my dissertation in early 2018. So I was sort of towards the end, and I had this plot line already written, set in the present day, of another former student speaking out on social media, accusing the teacher of sexual abuse. And so I had this plot line that really mirrored the Me Too movement in this really sort of uncanny way. And at first I didn't really know what to do with that parallel, um, because I mean, partly because when Me Too started, it was so focused on celebrity, and these stories of really famous people sort of abusing their power, and less so about ordinary people, which is what I consider myself to be writing about. But I felt a lot of frustration while I was watching Me Too play out, because maybe inevitably with a movement that takes place so much on social media, a lot of the nuances of these topics of consent, of sexual violence, it gets flattened down, and the narratives that become most prominent are often the neatest narratives, where the morals are sort of in black and white, and they're easy to digest in 1,000 words or less. And I'd been working on this novel for so many years and trying to put so much complexity into it. And so my understanding of these topics was very not simple. And so it got to a point where I think I tried to channel those frustrations about what I was seeing play out on social media and in Me Too into the book, and really sort of channel those frustrations into Vanessa's character. And there's these scenes with Vanessa and her therapist that I guess those moments come out where Vanessa verbalizes her sort of what she sees as like hypocrisy, maybe, of this pressure to speak out. And yeah, it's a tricky thing. And I think a lot of the stories that came out from Me Too, they do promote this idea of like this inherent sisterhood among women who have experienced sexual violence. And I don't know, I think that's in some way, like, I get it, I get why that feels good, but at the same time, like, women are human beings, and we have
We're all
different
different.
experiences.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so I tried to work that in a way that was still empathetic, and I try to write everything rooted in empathy. But yeah,
I think if the only thing that links women is victimhood, that's a pretty, yeah, that's not a really strong place to start a kind of
yeah.
relationship. So it's really, I love those scenes between Vanessa and her psychotherapist. They rang really true for me, actually. I thought they did an amazing job of showing the nuances of how Vanessa was actually feeling. So that works really well. And that kind of plays into a little bit the idea that, you know, that people constantly critiquing characters that they call unlikable as main characters, and we're used to seeing now, I think, after a few books that have come out, seeing older women as being, you know, we can accept an unlikable older woman character because you know, everyone kind of goes, oh yeah, after menopause you can, you know, come into your power and you can speak your mind, but we still don't accept a young woman who is what readers would call an unlikable character. And I think Vanessa's prickly, you know, so she has her likability is a little bit kind of on the downward end of the scale at times. Has that been a critique that you've come across, readers finding her unlikable?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some of that is a reaction, the reactions to her likability or lack thereof, I think are informed by maybe expectations readers might have coming into a story like this that's about sexual violence, that's about victimhood. And we're used to, I think, seeing victims as sort of not necessarily weak, but almost like martyrs, right? And often victims of sexual violence are seen as almost, in my mind, like annoyingly good, right? Like even if they and even if they have flaws or they make mistakes throughout the course of the narrative, at the end they sort of accept that they were victims, and then they triumph in the end, and that gives the reader a sense of you know, satisfying closure. And Vanessa, through really the entire novel, she's resisting that. And so I think that's where a lot of the idea of her being unlikable comes from. But it's a funny thing, because I feel like at least here in the US over the past 5 or 10 years or so, there's been a lot of critiques of the idea of women characters having to be likable. Like, I feel like I've read piece after piece of little essays about how that expectation put on women characters and women writers is unfair. So in a way, I'm surprised and continue to be surprised by so many people calling her unlikable, because I'm like, I thought we all agreed that this is like sort of a, you know, like not the best criticism or not the most thoughtful one, but it keeps coming up again and again. But
Try being a bookseller.
oh my
The amount
all
of
my
people
favorite
like,
stuff
I didn't like her. I didn't like her. It's like, too bad that you're not supposed to like her.
I don't really like reading, or I don't find novels featuring very overtly likable characters to be very interesting either. So I take it as like a sign that I'm writing the kind of book that I would like to read.
Excellent. And I mean, that kind of that likability factor also plays into the fact that she's basically an unreliable narrator, because she's very much made her decision about what this relationship is, and even if her view on it changes as she gets older, she can't unpick what she's made. And I suppose there's parallels to people who have been in cults, parallels to people who've been in, you know, really in families that are really kind of clothed and close. And you've kind of, you've done that really well, that, that she is both aware and unaware of what the reality is. Was that a tricky line to play?
It was, but I'm not sure how aware of it I was when I was working on the book, because so much of Vanessa's struggle to sort of see her experiences in a, you know, grounded way. I don't want to say like for what really happened, because that's so slippery, you know, but in a way that's grounded in her actual memories. Like, that struggle was so much reflected in my own sort of struggle with the material. And what I mentioned before, my sort of seeing this book that I was working on for such a long time as a love story, and then sort of shifting that into thinking of it as a story of trauma, I felt like in a lot of ways I was working through the grief of that, of sort of looking back over all those years of working on this, and feeling like I didn't understand it myself as a writer. I was putting that into Vanessa's struggle to to see her own experiences, I guess, for what they were, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And you know, this is a book about sex, and the sex scenes that are detailed in the narrative, you know, they're not, they don't make it sound like a great love story. You know, the sex is actually not super pleasant, even though she reframes that later. Was it difficult to write those quite gritty sex scenes?
They not nearly as difficult to write as they are for me to revisit now in reading them. When I was writing them, I was just so, you know, in Vanessa's perspective that I was sort of skimming along the surface in the way that I think she sort of skims along the surface in those experiences. And so, I mean, there were moments, especially the first night that she spends at his house, that's a very long scene, and that I remember feeling difficult to write. But I always have been, like, in my fiction, I've always written sex in the way that I write it. I wrote it in My Dark Vanessa as this sort of sometimes grotesque thing that isn't necessarily violent, maybe like emotionally violent, but is sort of not the most pleasant thing, where pleasure is always sort of marbled with maybe shame or what have you. That's just always sort of been a staple of my fiction. So it's interesting thinking of my first book being a book that's dealing so much with the ideas of like rape and consent, and the way that these sex scenes are sort of read within the context of those themes, and thinking of future books that I might write that might not be focused so much on sexual violence or consent, and the way that sex might be read in those books. I don't know.
It works really well. It certainly it certainly gives you, you know, the perspective of how she sees things to how the audience is seeing things. It gives you that disconnect, I suppose. And interesting that Lolita is at the heart of, you know, her life, Vanessa's life. She was given Lolita by Strane. Lolita is still one of my favourite books, and I read it when I was a teenager and had a very different reading of it when I was a teenager to coming back as an adult and reading it. And it was a lot funnier than I remembered when I read it as an adult. Like it was actually, I found it hilarious at times, but also horrible at times too. So I gather you read and reread Lolita as a part of your writing process over the years.
Yes, very much so. I read Lolita for the first time when I was 14, and I was just obsessed. I was obsessed with the book when I was a teenager. I remember I used to be able to recite the first chapter just from memory. I mean, I was fixated on it, partly because of the story was really alluring to me at that age, but also because I was an aspiring writer, and that was the most beautiful book I'd ever read. And reading Nabokov, it just made my mind sort of like come alive. I remember I had an electric typewriter that I would write that I'd write with in my bedroom, and I'd listen to, I had the audiobook of Jeremy Irons reading Lolita, and I'd listen to that and like write at the same time, and just, you know, I was just obsessed with it. And so it's a book that I continue to revisit, and it was relatively late in the writing process, I feel like, of My Dark Vanessa, that I decided, like, I want to bring in Lolita in this real sort of prominent way. And it was an interesting process, sort of deciding in what ways I wanted to do that. And it felt right to have Strane be the one to give Vanessa that copy of Lolita, but then also to have Vanessa become obsessed with it, almost to the point where Strane's like, you need to stop reading this and sort of equating us with this story. This isn't what we are. But she, I think she takes that novel and she turns it into something very much her own, in her own mind, which is something I think he really wasn't expecting.
And because of her English class, I suppose we do get an eye into lots of other works of fiction and poetry. It's almost, it's like you could write a little reading list from reading your book, and they would all be really beautiful works as well. You've referenced some amazing works. Were there books that were really influential in the writing of this? So did you have like a little stack of books that were like, I want it to be like this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Lolita, of course, is sort of the main one, but also Pale Fire, which is where the title My Dark Vanessa comes from, and also Nabokov's sort of gigantic self-indulgent novel Ada or Adder. It's like 800, 900.
I didn't quite get through that one.
Right? No one does. I read it at 19, right? I was obsessed. I was odd. But that novel, just the imagery of it is sort of lives in my mind forever. So Nabokov very much, but also there is a memoir published here in the US in the late 90s called The Kiss by Catherine Harrison.
Yeah, I love that book.
That was hugely influential on me when I read that for the first time. The way that Harrison in that memoir, she recounts a sexual relationship she had starting at 20 with her estranged father, who she only met once as a child and then meets when she's 20, and this relationship starts, and she's really challenging these ideas of complicity and consent, while also writing about, one of the most taboo subjects. And that was it changed me. I feel like when I first read that memoir. And then also, a lot of poetry really sunk its teeth into me. I love reading poetry because I can't write it, so I feel like I just like let myself admire it with just a pure admiration. And like Sylvia Plath, of course, was big, and she ended up in the novel, but also Anne Carson, this autobiography of Red, that was really influential. And also, oh, it's so good, so good. And
it's one of my favorites too.
Right?
Yeah.
So many. I do have a reading list on my website.
I'm going there immediately afterwards, because it sounds like I really love the books that you read writing this book, and that's probably why I love this book so much. I really highly recommend this to anyone, because it plays that lovely line between being an absolute page turner where you can't put it down, incredibly literary, but also it demands that you as a reader do some work. It's not actually going to give you everything and spoon feed you. It's going to make you work for it, which I love it as a reader. I love that I'm not being treated like an idiot when I'm reading a book, and this book does not treat me like an idiot. I think it's time now to open up to questions from the floor. Have we got any questions, Bianca?
We sure do. I'm really hoping we have time to get through all of them, but just in case we don't, we will do our best. But I will ask from the top. So Charlotte would like to know, Kate, more about your writing process. And this is something for, I think, all writers in the room would love to hear.
Sure. So I write every day, though the form that takes is really varied. But I try to get ideas down by hand in a journal that I sort of continuously keep, and I don't really worry about making much sense. Then that's just a way for me to try to get what's in my head down on paper, so I don't forget later. And when I'm working on a new piece of writing, I spend a lot of time in that stage where I'm just letting myself get the ideas down freely. And then once I start actually trying to write prose, it's really hard for me. That's the most difficult part, is sort of opening a blank Word document and getting the words, filling it. That's really intimidating for me. And so when I find myself getting stuck, when I'm at that point in the process where I'm sort of trying to write the scenes, if I find myself not moving forward, I move back to writing by hand, and that just makes my brain sort of work in a different way. And then throughout the writing process, once I'm really deep into it, it's this continuous back and forth until I get to the point where I have scenes done, and then I start line editing, and I'm very methodical, and I always try to move forward. I imagine myself like, they say sharks, right? They always swim even when they're sleeping. They're always moving forward. That's sort of what I try to do with my writing, because otherwise I feel like I'm spinning my wheels, or I'm like rewriting the opening over and over and over again as a way of procrastination. But yeah, writing every day. And I usually would always work in coffee shops, but that's not an option here anymore. So that's been that's been an adjustment, learning to write from home.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Thank you so much for those insights. Yeah, I'm always fascinated to know as well, writing by hand, how that changes the psychology of how the words end up on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the image of the electric typewriter too.
I wish I
Back in the
still
day.
had it.
Yeah.
I wish I still had it.
We have a question. Let me see, from Alawa. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. Now, Alawa's question is about, how does Vanessa's relationship with her father influence her relationship with Strane, or how does it not?
Yeah,
Really
that's a
good
good question. I feel, in my mind, I feel like it doesn't influence it much at all. And that was, I felt like when I was working on the book, I made a conscious decision not to sort of tease out that relationship between Vanessa and her father as any kind of parallel or a foil to her relationship with Strane. I really tried to have her relationship with her dad to be just kind of middle of the road and unremarkable, because doing that, in my mind, it felt a little subversive, because it felt like that would be a go-to thing that readers might look to as for sort of an explanation, I guess, for why this why she found herself in this situation with Strane. Like, what was her relationship with her father like? And I didn't want there to be anything too obvious there that the reader might pick up on. And I think that goes for her relationship with both of her parents. I tried to make it, not the best, but also not awful, just kind of, in my mind, ordinary, but readers might feel differently.
Yeah, I guess for me, I got the sense that they were a little bit, I guess, they were passive in a way that kind of really, I felt such a roller coaster of emotions reading this book. So we also have a question. Let's have a look, from Lyndall. Lyndall would love to know, love to hear more about what, Kate, what you're working on now.
Yeah, so I'm in the early stages of book 2 of my second book, and I'm so superstitious about it because I feel so good about it, and it feels very soon for me to feel so immersed in a whole new novel, because I worked on this one for so long. I was expecting there to be a long period of sort of almost like wandering around, not quite knowing what to do with myself, but it has come so quickly, or at least more quickly than I expected. And so I'm in the early stages of that. You could see there's like a little bit of a bulletin board behind me that's like scene outlines or written out. So that's what I'm working on now. And we'll see how long it takes. It's not, it will not take 18 years, but we'll see. I feel like I'm in whole new uncharted territory, both with a new subject matter, but also I know what I'm doing now to a certain extent, because I've written a novel. I've been successful at that. So we'll see, but it's very exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, we're thrilled to hear, not only what, success of My Dark Vanessa, but also, your endeavors into writing next. If we have time for, we have a couple more questions, if that's okay. Now, if it's okay to put them to you, but I'm going to slightly reword them only because I'm conscious of spoilers, and I know that not everyone in the audience today has read the book, and I'm very conscious that a few of us have, and we really want to also know a bit more. So is that okay if I sort of word them in a way that I'll give you a hint of what they're about, and you can decide for yourself how much information you want to give. Let's have a look. Now, Robin has asked, now with the operation that Strane has, It's up to you if you want to reveal what it is. The reasoning behind that. And I guess, yeah, if I'll let you kind of,
Right.
yeah, if
I'll
decide
spoil it.
if you think that's going to give away too much. I don't know if you want to mention.
I don't think it
like
gives
too much
away.
of a spoiler.
I don't think it gives away too much. So Strane, right? Strane he's single, unmarried, has never been married, has no children, and he has had a vasectomy when he's in his 30s, I think early 30s. And that I wanted the reasoning behind that to be a little ambiguous, but the way that I think you could read it, and the way that I think Vanessa starts to read it, but she doesn't totally let herself, is the idea that Strane chose not to have children very deliberately because he was concerned about him abusing his own children. I think that's the reading that's in the novel, but that isn't the way that you have to read it, because that's also something that's coming from Vanessa's perspective, which isn't always reliable and isn't, she doesn't really even know that much about Strane, really not that much about his background or even his daily life. So that's sort of what she arrives at, or starts to arrive at. Like, she won't let herself think about that too deeply, but that's what I wanted to sort of be in the text, and the reader can choose to take that however they will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Robin, your question is, it's really interesting how you've sort of, I guess, almost given an interpretation you might have taken from the reading as well, which is maybe, he knew it was within himself to be having these affairs, and didn't want to be blackmailed if there was a pregnancy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's another way to read it. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. And now, this last question, I haven't had any more questions through since this one comes in, but we do have a question, and again, just slightly rewording because I don't want to give away too much. But your plan for how, I guess, in the towards the conclusion of the novel, and even, I don't know, I think it happens earlier than I expected, but what happens around Strane, and was that something that you had always planned, I guess, with planning out the novel, or was it more something that came about afterwards in the editing process?
Yeah, it's something I always planned, and I think this isn't too much of a spoiler, but just having him exit the story was really important to me, and it was essential in my mind, because I felt like Vanessa wouldn't be able to connect with others, especially other women, unless that happened. And so that was the point in which that happened sort of moved around in the novel structurally.
Yeah, I did wonder that.
Yeah, that changed, and I think in some ways the structure of the novel is a little odd in that it's somewhat almost like bisected, whereas I think often in like thrillers, for instance, like I think the tension of that might be drawn out a bit more. But I sort of, I chose to structure sort of his arc the way that I did, to allow Vanessa to have a lot of space within the novel to open up, I guess, and to have that feel like it happens at a pace that felt realistic to me, at least, and not too rushed and not too neat, but drawn out, a little drawn out.
Absolutely. I have to say that the structure of this book is absolutely genius. It really does. It does feel like you have taken your time to get the structure right, because it is, often you read a book and you're disappointed by the ending. I mean, endings are hard and beginnings are hard. But this book, you're playing your way to an ending which is satisfying and surprising and interesting all in one, and that leaves you as an active viewer. I think that I just have to say this is an astounding piece of work, and if anyone's in the audience who hasn't read it, I really do recommend that you get your hands on it. Whatever you bring to the book is going to be your take on it. It's a book that has 1,000 takes in it, which is great. So congratulations on the book, Kate. It's
Thank you.
really, really good. And what is it like, just as a final question before we end our session, what is it like releasing a book into a pandemic? You were one of the first people to do this.
Yeah, I mean, it continues to be, I've been thinking about this recently. I feel like it heightens the sense that I've had ever since my book sold, which is like, is this real? Is this really happening? It feels so surreal. And I feel like the pandemic has exacerbated that to a certain extent, because I didn't have a book tour, right? Everything's online. And so I haven't been face to face with readers at all. And so after I do anything for the book, I sort of close my computer, and then life is exactly the same, the sort of unchanged, just at home. And so I feel in some ways very disconnected from the book, but then at the same time, I am, of course, eternally grateful for the internet to have a chance, at least, to participate and to have some kind of connection with readers. But it'll be interesting whenever the sort of world goes back to normal again, where I can visit bookstores and have events, how it will feel to finally be able to interact with readers in person.
Well, I do hope that when that happens, that we can get you out to Australia and we can sit down in person and over a glass of wine and talk about this, because I really do feel like this book is really the book of the year for me, I think, at this point. So thank you so much for writing it. And I'm actually going to open the room up now for people to clap. So what I'm going to do is allow participants to unmute themselves. So everyone, let's put your hands together for the wonderful Kate Elizabeth Russell. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's been amazing.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Really good. Thank you.
Can I also just say a big thank you to Krissy as well for your just brilliant questions. And I think the conversation was just seamless. So absolutely wonderful.
It's really great. Hopefully we'll get this up on YouTube and you can listen to anything that you missed the first time round. But lovely to see you, and hopefully we'll catch you again soon.
Yes, and please purchase the book. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.